Is this familiar to you? This music, a white background, Laura font, text-colored yellow, blue, or green, and on your TikTok For You page? If so, then you may already be somewhat familiar with the Escam escapism anthology written by TikTok user @ScribbleShrimp. And if you're not, then don't worry, you will be soon. Escam is a piece of media I randomly stumbled into being a fan of when it was in its prime, and ever since it was abruptly left unfinished for reasons we'll eventually get to, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It has carved itself a home inside of my brain, and the only way I can think of to excise it is to pass it along to you, if you would be so kind as to be its new host. But before we delve too deep into anything, I would like to preemptively warn you that this will get heavy. Escam is a piece of media that is largely founded upon people experiencing profound traumas and what happens to them as they have no choice but to wash their face and keep moving. You'll see specific content warnings for each upcoming chapter during its title card, but if that already doesn't sound appealing, I completely understand. However, if you like tales of traumatized transgender teenagers told through TikToks, then this is the video for you. Now open wide. ScribbleShrimp is your classic jack-of-a-few-trades internet creator. While they are a talented artist, and even the creator of a few animatics on their YouTube channel, they are most well known for their writing. And no, I'm not referring to all their riddle-battered John Martin fanfiction. I already made one video about an AO3 fic, and God willing, I will never do that again. I am instead referring to their original work entitled Escam. Shrimp describes Escam as simply a story about meat, among other things. Which makes sense, as Escam is Latin for meat, but of course those other things contain multitudes. And while Escam is available on Archive of Our Own, as of right now there's only a little bit of the story there. If you want to read the entirety of Escam, or at least all that's publicly available, you must do so through the @ScribbleShrimp TikTok account. On their profile they have a playlist labeled Escam Escapism Anthology, if you don't want to filter through the rest of their posts, like all of the meme slideshows and Jack Horner thirst posting. Now, despite Escam being hosted on TikTok, don't assume that it's just a small little story strewn about a few posts. That Escam playlist has 161 TikToks in it, and in fact, Escam is almost novel length in its entirety. To be specific, it's over 44,000 words long. If you're wondering how I know that, it's because I have what is likely the only physical copy of Escam in existence. For a week this summer, I spent all of my time transcribing all of Escam onto a single Google Doc, which turned out to be 130 double-sided pages when printed out physically. I was obsessing over these colored sentences for so long that you could have almost mistaken me for a Homestuck fan. Even if my hands hurt for a few days after climbing this mountain of a task, I'm still happy I did it, because it allowed me to grow intimately familiar with this text. So familiar that I even started to recognize some of Shrimp's typing quirks, if you will. Like often using more than 3 periods for ellipses, having a weird aversion towards directly naming any other piece of media, consistently saying conversion instead of conversation. You get it. Escam's first episode was published on October 24th, 2022, and the series continued until February 24th, 2023, when extenuating circumstances forced it to conclude much earlier than it was planned to. One of the most interesting parts of Escam's story is that it is delivered to you piecemeal. This story is not told chronologically. Instead, each TikTok, being a slideshow with up to 35 images, or in some cases a short animatic, chronicles a random tiny moment in the story's timeline, making it the reader's job to piece everything together. Or not, it is labeled an anthology after all, although it is definitely possible to connect some dots if you so please. Every entry into Escam's story falls into one of two categories, either an individual character monologuing to the reader about something, or a one-on-one conversion, usually between 2 of the 3 main characters, but not always. Now that I mention the characters though, you may be wondering what kind of a cast we're dealing with here. Well, don't worry, I can assure you that the main trio of Escam is a perfectly ordinary group of folks. Just ignore the smell of rotting flesh.
I feel obligated to explain some things. Eagle-eyed fans of mine may have already noticed that I haven't exactly made anything in a hot second. Well, if the second was ever hot, it's definitely cold by now, as it's been over 2 years. And I don't really have any justification for that. I know that people who are nicer to me than I am to myself would say that I don't necessarily need one, but still, I feel bad. But it's not like I wasn't trying. I am haunted by a graveyard's worth of failed ideas. Over these past 2 years, there have been so many moments where I am absolutely enthralled with ideas, and I get so excited about them, and start conceptualizing them, and imagining how other people would react to them, and then it's nothing. It doesn't go anywhere. So much lead wasted writing, so much time wasted typing. It's gotten so hard for me to do anything lately. Most of the time, I just guiltily scream at myself in my head while continually remaining non-productive. All of my internal motivation has completely dissipated. I really only ever get things done when some external factor is forcing me to. Which reminds me, I still actually have been creating content quite often, just for a much more niche audience. As these 2 years have passed, I've garnered a lot of attention for myself, for the work I do for my school's daily broadcast news program. So technically, I still have been making videos fairly frequently. They're just only 2 minutes long, and made for an audience of only 1,000-ish people instead of the entire internet. And it's really cool being the news guy. Praise through social media or YouTube comments is one thing, but it's a completely different experience when a fellow student or even a teacher comes up to you in the hallway to compliment a video you made. Not that I'm discounting digital praise, God knows that I still need it and will thank you profusely if you ever give it to me. But it has also been a lot. The novelty of being recognized has worn off by now, and sometimes it doesn't even feel worth it for the amount of effort it takes to maintain this status I've been given. I've always had an awkward relationship with creation. Whenever I am capable of doing anything, I do too much. I will destroy myself if it means that I can make something perfect. It's torture only doing things in extremes. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting consumed by myself, becoming ruined as a result of nobody's actions but my own. I still don't know what exactly is wrong with me, but whatever it is manifests itself in the relationship between me and this fucking camera. And I've noticed that these self-destructive tendencies of mine are only exacerbated now that I'm academically obligated to perpetuate them. Now I have deadlines that can impact my grades if I don't follow through with them. Now I have people who can come up to me in the hallway and ask why I haven't made a video in so long, or make fun of me whenever I make a mistake. And sometimes it gets bad. It's so surreal to have to edit a video around footage of you crying, and then have people watch the final product the next day, blissfully unaware of the exhaustion you inflicted upon yourself in order to create it. However, on a positive note, it has made me want to come back here. If from nothing else, at least from the desire to finally make something for myself again. It has been over 2 years since I've made anything completely absent of academic obligation. Over 2 years since I've had full creative control. I miss it, I do. It's been so long since I've made anything just for fun. I haven't had fun in so long. But I want to try again. And I hope you'll join me.
Escam is a story about meat, specifically 3 sacks of it. Their names are Neil, EFRON, and Mallory. Neil LUDWIG, represented by yellow text, is a trans man who was doomed from the start because of his mother. As a young teenager, his mom was not at all accepting of his identity, and that fact, along with the first appearances of symptoms of his clinical depression, drove Neil to, at one point, ingest a bottle of rat poison. This attempt at suicide was not successful and resulted in Neil's mom sending him to a wilderness camp, which canonically was Dr. Phil's turnaround ranch. Because of how little attention Neil was given as a child, he desperately searched for it on the internet instead, which led to him getting groomed. If you're not familiar with that term, grooming in this case refers to the act of an adult sexually exploiting and abusing a minor. Keep that definition in mind as it's going to become important later. All this trauma makes Neil a deeply dysfunctional young adult. He is petrified of the idea of ever being alone and still always carnally desires attention by any means necessary. In his first solo appearance in an episode titled Attention, we learn the full extent of his abandonment issues as he begs the reader,
"You can hit me, bite me, insult me, spit on me. I don't care. I don't care. Just please stay. Please continue giving me attention. Don't let me be alone. I can't handle being alone. I'm worthless. Please. Please don't leave."
These compounding issues will come to the forefront as Neil enters his first and only relationship, where as readers we witness the rise and fall of it, or more accurately, the millions of peaks and valleys. Speaking of that, Abraham EFRON, represented by blue text, was raised as a devout Catholic, which rules her life no matter her age. As a child, her mother was incredibly abusive, and the small church community she lived in was incredibly dismissive of that fact, which creates the foundation for the issues she will have to learn to live with for the rest of her life. In her first solo appearance in an episode titled Superpowers, we learn how this trauma still affects her to this day.
All it takes is someone raising their voice or accidentally slamming a door, and suddenly I'm a child under the bed again, trying to breathe quietly, terrified of making a single noise. I wish I wasn't a time traveler.
After enduring her abuse for long enough, EFRON kills her mom and runs away to a nearby shelter, never coming back to that town again. It is there where she and Neil first meet each other and quickly begin forming a connection. However, she still has plenty of problems to work through. Her Catholicism and the way her mother treated her are still deeply rooted in her way of life, which aren't the only points of contention in her relationship with Neil, but they don't help. Their relationship is maintained for a surprisingly long time given everything working against it, but eventually it ends with a bang, and EFRON is left to find someone new. Mallory LEEROY, represented by green text, is described by Shrimp as a platonic necrophile, which is definitely a choice. They are autistic, which makes it especially difficult for them to be social with the living people around them, although the bar isn't exactly set that high by the other two. In their first solo appearance, in an episode titled Dancing Lessons, they explain how difficult they find it to hold a conversation with other people.
"I want to reach into their flesh and dissect what makes them human. What makes them fundamentally different? What makes them flawlessly cavort as I trip over my own feet? Did I miss the dancing lesson? Is that the reason I'm the only one who doesn't know the steps?"
Surprise! They also have mommy issues and a traumatic childhood. Mallory's mother died in childbirth, which their father forever resents them for, to the point of literally naming them Mal, meaning bad in a handful of languages. And as a kid, their one and only friend was a teenager many years older than them. They were so happy to be acknowledged and treated with care by someone else that they were oblivious to the fact that this friend was taking advantage of them, forcing them to play certain games, which will lead Mallory to forever be haunted by the feeling of unwanted hands on their body. As an adult, they found work as a mortician, which fulfills their desire to be close to others, although in quite a literal sense. While they may not be the most sociable towards any of their living colleagues, they find enough of a connection in the corpses they work with every day, which as a bonus can never touch them without permission. One day, EFRON discovers Mallory doing some DIY mortician work on an abandoned road late at night, which serves as the spark for their own relationship. EFRON thinks Mallory was a gift from God, but Mr. Jesus is very far away, and their own flavor of relationship instability will rear its ugly head soon enough. The plot of Escam comes from exploring how these three people's pasts affect their present, and chronicling the evolution of these two central relationships, distorting teenage puppy love into the most toxic codependent nightmare you've ever seen in your life. I love it. Escam is a story that could have only been told on TikTok, which is the best and worst thing about it. Now, I won't be doing that much of an in-depth analysis here, but if you're interested in a more thorough examination of the plot, I would suggest watching the only other video about Escam on YouTube, a now unlisted video essay posted on Christmas Eve of last year made by someone with the username PPPoopoo. Anyways, you may think that it would be quite limiting to try to tell a story through just individual batches of up to 35 images of colored text on a white background, but Shrimp makes surprisingly great use of this medium. For example, the story only being able to progress a few sentences at a time in each image makes it especially significant whenever an image is intentionally left blank. This happens fairly often, like whenever Shrimp decides that a sentence needs to sit for a moment, or whenever a character needs to think before responding, but sometimes these pauses can hold a lot more weight, like when characters are implied to be doing things other than talking. In the episode Comparing Palms, there are intermittent pauses in Neil and Efron's conversation as they hold hands for the first time, and in the episode First Kiss for one of them, we are treated to gaps that are 3 images long as, you guessed it, they share their first kiss. It's such a small detail to compliment, but in a story that's told exclusively through dialogue, there's no natural way to say, and then they kissed, so forcing the reader to actively fill in that gap feels like the perfect choice. However, the absence of words can also be utilized in a strategically devastating way, like in the episode Word Waterfall. As Neil and Efron continue dating, their relationship quietly grows more and more dysfunctional, leading to moments like these.
Okay, so there's actually a theory that the companion cube is made out of the souls and flesh of previous test subjects. Isn't that fascinating? And it would make sense why you would need to incinerate it before moving on, since they wanted
Lord, do you ever stop talking? I should have phrased that less harshly. My apologies, I have a headache.
It's fine. I get it. I'll shut up now. Sorry.
The silence here is heartbreaking, and that feeling is only exacerbated when you read this on TikTok and have to manually swipe through each individual picture, representing a painful amount of seconds where the conversation is completely halted. Another technique Shrimp utilizes is changing the colors of the text to do more than just differentiate the characters. This may just mean changing the color of one specific instance of a pronoun to make it clear that a character is referring to one specific person, like in Funny, where Mallory talks about the friend that traumatized them, but it can also be used to elicit a much more emotional reaction, like in Old Habits. In this episode, Efron accidentally calls Mallory Neil, which worsens their worry that Efron only sees them as just Neil's replacement. This worry is validated at the end of the episode when this happens.
Okay, I'm sorry for overreacting, just you know that this is a major insecurity and fear of mine.
I'm sorry. I don't want to cause you to spiral.
Okay.
I love you. You know that, right?
I love you too.
Again, it's so simple but so effective. It's such an elegant way to show a character's inner thought process. The most blatant example of colors changing, however, is the color of a character's text becoming darker as they experience more trauma. When we read about Neil and Mallory as children, we see their text with a brighter color, and while their lives still may not be perfect, they have yet to experience the singular moment that will define the rest of their lives. For Neil, it's his attempt, and for Mallory, it's their encounters with that friend of theirs. After each of these characters' respective incidents, their text becomes a darker shade, as they have more awful memories weighing on them at any given moment. And you may have picked up on the detail that Efron is one shade of blue when with Neil, and a darker shade when around Mallory. If you're wondering what her defining moment is, it occurs in Escam's climax, an episode titled Unwashed Dishes. In this episode, Neil, in a rare act of cleanliness, washes the dishes for Efron, although not to her standards. That soon doesn't matter though, as Neil gets one last kiss from her before pulling out a gun with the express intention of ending his own life with it. Efron desperately attempts to talk him out of doing so, but Neil resists, explaining that this is his one moment, his one opportunity to leave an impact, his one chance to finally have the last word. Efron keeps on trying to calm Neil down even as he yells at her to shut up, but still she keeps on begging and pleading and trying to grapple the gun out of his hands until—
Neil! Neil?
And from that point on, Neil haunts Efron, both figuratively and literally. Now here is where some of the drawbacks of this story being hosted on TikTok become painfully obvious. As anyone who's attempted to post anything remotely PG-13 on the platform would know, their community guidelines are incredibly strict. And so, despite this being the most significant episode of the entire Escam escapism anthology, it doesn't exist on Shrimp's profile anymore. It is only survived through people saving the slideshow and then reposting it themselves, which is not a courtesy that has been provided to every single taken down Escam episode. Some Escam episodes that discuss equally sensitive subjects posts were sometimes given a slightly more forgiving fate, with Shrimp being able to repost them, albeit heavily censored, which I shouldn't have to tell you makes for a worse reading experience. I mean, they had to preface unwashed dishes with a content warning that said CW, self-inflicted kicking the bucket, which is deeply unserious for what follows. Still though, while Escam being a story told through TikToks may have limited it in some aspects, I think that the sheer accessibility provided by the platform is what made it so successful in the first place.
These past 2 years have given me ample time to self-reflect, to reevaluate myself. And one of many conclusions that I have come to is, I think I'm transgender, but I don't really know what to do about it. I have actively disliked my body for as long as I can remember. In the 5th grade, my friends nicknamed me Whale. It was a whole thing. While I eventually learned to accept this forever large form I inhabit, the dissatisfaction never went away. It just became a more abstract feeling. My flesh doesn't fit right. The idea of what I thought was me became more and more separate from what I would see in the mirror or on camera. And when people would say hello to me and refer to me by my name, it increasingly often felt as if they were referring to someone else. It felt as if I was missing an essential part of being a person. For a while now, I've been a casual they-them user. I didn't think much of it. It was just a courtesy that people could provide me with if they felt so inclined. But in the summer of 2021, I asked my closest friends to try out referring to me with she, just to see what it felt like. And at first, it felt off, of course. That's what going by one specific thing your entire life will do. But quickly, it started feeling really comfortable in a way that had me seriously start to consider some things. I started painting my nails just to have a scrap of femininity, and right before the new year, I asked my partner at the time if they could call me by my name, but backwards. Nadia. New year, new me, right? People calling me Nadia felt really, really good. So slowly I worked to reintroduce myself to those I was closest to. And it was so unbelievably scary, but it was worth it to hear my name come out of their mouth. And by now, it's somewhat common knowledge, I would say, but I feel like I've hit a sort of wall recently. There's only so much I can do with my metadata, so to speak. I know that at some point I need to start doing something more physical. And I know that saying this might be problematic, but it feels like I don't deserve to be referred to with she when I still look and sound like this. But I'm in a position where literally anything I do to myself would be broadcast to 1,000 people. I mean, I'm the news guy. I feel a pressure to uphold that. And that's not even considering doing anything outward online, where literally anyone could comment on what I'm trying to make people do. Am I going to have to rename this channel to Nadia Ram? I haven't thought that far ahead yet, but we'll cross that blue, pink, and white-colored bridge when we need to. Regardless of the location, it's just so fucking paralyzing. Sometimes I feel like I'm consuming myself, encasing Nadia within the version of me that other people are expecting. I don't even think of it in my head as being trans. Whenever I come out to someone, I think of it as just coming out as Nadia. I feel like I don't deserve to be specific with what I mean by that just yet. But knowing this information and being so confident that it's true, I can only stay stagnant with it for so long. This cannot be all that I am for the rest of my life. I cannot accept that. So I take control where I can. You don't know how much money I've wasted on nail polish, how much blood I've lost shaving all of my body just for all of the hair to immediately grow back the very next day. And I told myself if I ever came back to YouTube, I would need to publicly reckon with this immediately, because I would hate myself for every public appearance I make where I don't. So here we are. I am doing all that I can. I hope it's enough.
Escam is a story that works. Every episode has likes at least in the 4-digit range, but commonly they have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of likes at their most popular. And I think that comes from a very lucky combination of story and medium, because Escam's anthological nature makes it the perfect story to be told on TikTok. Although every bite-sized episode of Escam can function as a little piece of the puzzle that is the story's overarching narrative, having background context isn't necessary to still appreciate the story at the surface. Each episode is its own individual anecdote that encapsulates a uniquely human experience and has the chance to be algorithmically recommended to someone who could relate to it. Escam's most popular episodes are mostly moments where Neil and EFRON are at their most outwardly dysfunctional and arguing, with commenters debating whether yellow or blue is in the right, or seeing themselves in these characters. That's why Escam's most popular episodes have that status. Random readers saw these deeply flawed characters going through deeply sad experiences, and it felt familiar to them. Whether it reminded them of themselves, of a past partner, or anyone else in their life, this little piece of writing was enough to invoke that perception of familiarity. So naturally they were compelled to give it a like, or share it with someone, and continue the cycle for the next random reader. Speaking of cycles, Escam being an anthology still makes for an incredibly enthralling reading experience if you're an active fan of the story too. While of course there's a lot of enjoyment to be derived from trying to piece the timeline together, Escam's story being so ruthlessly non-linear makes for some especially poignant realizations while reading as well. Reading handfuls of episodes that all follow a similar formula, with EFRON finding an issue with Neil's behavior, the two arguing about it, the idea of EFRON leaving being brought up, then Neil desperately pleading for her to stay, explaining that there's no possibility he could survive without her, is profoundly devastating to read, no matter the specific order these episodes may go in, because the fact that so many of these episodes exist in the first place shows us that these people are trapped. This perpetual pattern of fighting, then threatening to leave, then threatening to die, and then both of them submitting to each other's whims with an "I love you" is heartbreaking to have to bear witness to. Casual readers may think of these episodes just as arguments with an explicit winner and loser, but more involved readers will understand that this goes beyond that. These episodes are symptoms of a disease that's quietly eating at the both of them. Neil and EFRON are made for each other in the same way a knife is made for a wound. And for even more opportunities to break your heart while reading, Escam's non-linear story makes it especially easy for readers to compare these characters' past to their present, and vice versa. The episode immediately following Unwashed Dishes is Foolish Fantasies, a Neil monologue where he talks about how happy he is.
For the first time in my entire life, I can actually envision a future for myself. I hope it lasts.
Which is evil. Jumping from distinctly different points in these characters' lives makes for some really powerful juxtapositions. Every episode where a character is happy instills this feeling of dread in the reader, as they wholly understand that this feeling is only temporary. And every episode where a character is debilitatingly sad is made worse by knowing exactly everything that went wrong to get them to that point. A similar feeling is evoked whenever there are direct comparisons between EFRON's relationship with Neil and her relationship with Mallory, which shows us how she has changed as a person and how she hasn't. Like in the episode Exceptional, where Mallory starts to acknowledge how codependent their relationship is becoming.
Because while I know it's unhealthy and the reasonable part of my brain tells me that I am not special enough to be an exception, I simply am too intelligent and self-aware to get stuck in a cycle of abuse. She told me that herself.
The poison drips through. But the whiplash created by putting two distinctly different episodes back to back also serves to make sure the reader never spends too much time empathizing with any character, and emphasizes the point that nobody in this story is redeemable. Escam's characters are made to be depressingly easy to sympathize with, but Escam's story is engineered to make you feel bad for sympathizing with them. They are all awful people, but for unflinchingly human reasons. You may feel bad for Neil after seeing how badly he was treated by EFRON and their relationship, but then you learn that he did what he did with the explicit intention of traumatizing EFRON, to make her forever haunted by every mistake she ever made that drove him to make that choice. You may feel bad for EFRON after learning that her mother once forced her to murder a pet chicken she was raising, but then you learn that once Neil died, she dumped his body on an abandoned road and ate him. You may feel bad for Mallory after learning about how badly they were treated by their peers as a kid, but then you learn that they steal clothes off corpses and once found a blank canvas on an abandoned road and decided to embalm it for fun. Hold on a second.
He was shot in the head, right?
Yes. Why?
Then why were his organs missing?
How do you know that? Mallory, how do you know that?
Escam, in its weird non-linear TikTok format, works because of moments like these, where everything we've been able to read so far culminates into a much bigger picture. A portrait of who these people are, what they've gone through, and what they've done. And there's so much more I want to talk about. I want to analyze the significance of cannibalism and every other recurring piece of symbolism and motif in this story. I want to explain why my favorite episode is this one random Neil monologue. I want to talk about how Mallory is literally me for real. But, unfortunately, there is something much more important I need to discuss. Escam is a story that is over. You may remember me mentioning that Escam never had the chance to officially conclude, that it had to end abruptly for a reason I didn't specify. I avoided clarifying earlier on because I felt as if my reasoning would loom over everything else I had to say, but it would be wrong of me to not tell you at some point. If you're already familiar with Escam, then you may be somewhat dreading what I'm about to say, or admittedly, you may just be wondering why I didn't bring this up sooner, but regardless, here goes. Like all of the worst things, it happened in a Discord server. Shrimp has operated the Shrimp Tank, a Discord server for fans of their work, ever since May of last year. The announcement for the server coincided with the release of the 7th chapter of their most popular Batman x Riddler fanfiction. Of course, at that time, the only people there joined because they enjoyed Shrimp's writing on AO3, but as Escam started a few months later and quickly became popular, naturally their server grew as well. At time of writing, the Shrimp Tank is home to over 3,600 crustaceans, although I'm sure at some point that number used to be much higher. Because while things were going great for a month or two, and a real tight-knit community was being formed within the server, on December 19th, Shrimp, in a baffling action I have tried and failed to find a reason for, asked the general chat if anyone would be interested in rap battling. Some members took the bait and began some mean little back and forths, jokingly insulting Shrimp, then having Shrimp diss them back. At one point, Shrimp, in a moment of self-awareness, said, "All of the good rhymes I can think of are too mean. I do not feel comfortable saying them to a young teenager." And then 2 minutes later, Shrimp called someone a groomer's wet dream. To be specific, they sent this message.
Bold words coming from someone with EFRON in his self-roles. So much ego despite only being useful for your holes. Commenting on every video, desperate to be seen. Lord, it's so pathetic. You are a groomer's wet dream.
I feel like this is a good time to mention that, according to the roles Shrimp has in this server, they are 18 to 20 years old. And according to the partner of the person Shrimp was saying this to, they were 16 at the time. So this was a legal adult telling a minor 2 to 4 years younger than them that they were only useful for their holes and the wet dream of someone who would want to sexually manipulate them. I hope I don't have to explain why, despite the rap battle context, that's bad. There was no immediate actual backlash. Everyone who was participating in these rap battles just had the instinct to react to how crazy of a bar that was, and continue on with roasting each other. But that one message was left to simmer, and after a few months it reached its boiling point, and sometime in late February the message resurfaced. This time a screenshot of it was posted to TikTok, meaning that it was exposed to a much larger audience, the vast majority of whom were deeply upset with Shrimp for sending this message. And as a minor, I find that reaction to be very justifiable. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing to ever happen in a Discord server, but it was still unequivocally a mistake that Shrimp deserves to be held accountable for. I mean, in a server where you have to send a moderator a photo of your legal ID in order to access 18+ channels, and in a server where one of the rules is literally, if you would not say it to a 13-year-old, do not say it here, you would think that the singular person who this entire server is dedicated to would be more careful. But that's just me, though. However, as is common with bouts of modern online drama, people took this one awfully stupid decision and used it as justification to start finding anything else they could possibly use to discredit Shrimp and funnel more negative attention toward them. This eventually got to the point where Shrimp was driven entirely off of TikTok and retreated to their former home of Tumblr. The last Escam episode was published on February 24th. It's called Unrealistic Goals, and it is a regular, unceremonious Neil monologue, posted with zero knowledge that it was going to be the anthology's finale. The last things Shrimp ever posted to TikTok were a Homestuck meme and a collection of movie posters edited to be Shrimp-themed on April 13th, a date that has zero significance to me. The day before that was the last time Shrimp ever updated the AO3 adaptation of Escam, and they haven't posted anything since. Escam came down with Shrimp, hand in a lovable hand.
While I've been gone, I was also in a relationship. For a while, it was the best thing I ever had. We were made for each other. It was genuinely the closest I had ever felt with a person at that time. They helped me discover I was Nadia, and for that I will sincerely forever be grateful. But I don't think I was ever prepared to know them to their fullest extent. Perhaps there were warning signs earlier on that I could have caught if I was smarter, but it's much too late for that now. I was naive. I was happy. I was in love. As our relationship progressed, it started taking a lot out of me to stay with them, but I loved them. I loved them so much that it didn't bother me when I would ruin parties with my friends, as I failed to discreetly argue with them because my friends could very clearly notice how concernedly I was staring at my phone. I loved them so much that I didn't mind that they forever tainted the memory of me performing in my first ever play because they got mad at me for ignoring their texts even though I was busy being on stage. I loved them so much that I didn't care that I spent my 16th birthday sobbing on call, begging them to not kill themselves. Not that I could be bothered by any of that if I even wanted to. I mean, they told me so many times that I was the only reason they were still alive. I was warned by many friends that the threat of death should not be the only reason a relationship is maintained, but what else was I supposed to do but stay? I had a job to do, I had a role to play, and I needed to play it well because the life of the most important person I had ever known was at stake. But once, I flubbed a line. I said no when I was supposed to say yes. They got so angry, so upset that I wasn't as close with them as they wanted me to be. I cannot handle people being mad at me, so from that point forward, I indulged them. I showed them what they wanted to see. I did what they wanted to do. I loved them so much that I learned to cope with the fact that I was now afraid of the sound of my phone vibrating, because it could mean the start of a conversation I didn't want to have, or a request that I didn't want to fulfill. After I eventually gathered up the courage to confront them about how pressured they made me feel, they blamed me for not saying anything sooner. I broke up with them less than a month later. One time, after a particularly rough post-breakup conversation, I quietly observed them post some things for the sake of comforting themselves. They told themselves to cry until they were sick, and then to wash their face and keep moving. And when I first read that, I got really angry. How dare they declare themselves as the person who needs comforting? After everything they did to me, they're the person who needs reassurance? But if that sentence has any positive qualities, it's that it stuck with me. It has remained in my life for much longer than they have. It's been a long while since then, but I feel like I've been slowly rotting since. Sometimes I still remind myself of them, in how I instinctively react to certain things, in the ways I find myself accidentally treating those who I'm closest to, in my volatility. I'm really worried that I'm haunted, I don't know if this wound I have in my heart is something that can be healed with time. And I really don't know what I'm supposed to do, because it has been over a year, and I have still yet to figure out how I am supposed to fix this. How I can fix myself. Stop looking at me.
I try not to think about the end. I truly do. But I can't help myself. It's in my nature. I imagine a future without you, and it makes me ache. I imagine the horrendous feeling of thinking of your stupidly perfect face when I watch my favorite movie. Of those moments and scenes I used to enjoy becoming nauseating. So I'll only eat my second favorite dessert when I'm with you. I'll keep the songs most special to my heart to myself. It's not like I'm planning for this to be over. I'm just preparing for the worst case scenario. But if it does end and all our sweet memories turn sour, I refuse to let you tarnish my other interests as well. The only thing I'll allow you to ruin is me.
As Escam's fate solidified, Shrimp naturally had something to say about it. On February 26th, in the middle of the afternoon, Shrimp took to the announcements channel of their Discord server and manically delivered an almost 2,000-word-long speech explaining their actions and detailing their thoughts on everything. I'm going to cut some paragraphs out for the sake of brevity and sensitivity, but if you want to read the entire thing, you can still join Shrimp's server in its archival state and do so. You'll just have to scroll up in the announcements channel for a few seconds. Anyways, statement begins.
Howdy!
Oh my god. Sorry, I know I shouldn't interrupt, but oh my god. Really? Sorry.
Howdy. Recently, a few of my old chats from this server have been getting brought up. My first instinct was to get defensive and say, hey, those were okay to say, no one was uncomfortable, we were just goofing around or sharing experiences. But in hindsight, people were probably just afraid to speak up because of the power imbalance. On some level, I am aware that the majority of people here look up to me. I have no idea why, I just write text on a white background, anyone can do that. But I should have been more careful to avoid triggering others. I'm guilty of ignoring my own rules due to getting caught up in the moment. Things I would have banned or even reported others for, I've let myself get away with because I knew I didn't have malicious intent, despite a main theme in my writing being that people can hurt others without meaning to. It's not an excuse, obviously, but I struggle a lot with social cues and what is appropriate to say. I was under the assumption that if someone could handle my writing, which, while its own story, still has a lot of direct references to things I've personally experienced, then they would be fine with topics related to it. Once again, sorry if I made anyone uncomfortable. I think overall Escam has helped a few people, which I'm grateful for, but maybe fostering a community full of vulnerable, traumatized people wasn't a good idea. If I'm being honest, Escam and its short sequel were supposed to be a suicide note of some sort. A weird, invasive culmination of my experiences and the characters in my head. I wanted to leave some impact, some proof that I was here, like a final manifesto of the dialogue and ideas that haunt me before I could put myself out of my misery. Spoilers, everyone dies at the end, which was supposed to include me. If you have ever felt personally bad because of something I've said or done, I'm sorry. You don't know me on a personal level, you aren't entitled to understand my suicidal urges, except you already do, because you've read them. You've read about my characters' abuse, their fears, their difficulties. My characters are not me. In case it's not extremely clear, I have never eaten a person, been a grave robber, or ruined some perfectly fine dishes. I don't hold the same opinions as them, their story is something separate from me. But I have tried to break up with someone because they came out as trans and I felt like it was too contradictory. I've gone weeks without showering. I've been asked out as a joke. I've held the remains of a ruined stuffed animal and wondered if I'm equally as used up. I've felt violent envy towards people I care about because I resented that they were mentally well in a way I can never perfectly achieve. I can't trust myself to not expose every detail about my life, I guess. I often forget that I'm a person and not a character that I can analyze. I don't feel like a human, I feel like a bunch of concepts briefly possessing a body. Escam is fun and important for me to write, but sharing intimate explorations of your mental illness for thousands to see and judge is probably not good for anyone.
Fuck.
It started out as vents in my notes app and poetry I shared with my therapist, and now it's turned into a fandom. And I'm grateful people resonate with my work, and I have spent countless hours happily looking at fan art and discussions, but recently it's been very draining. I genuinely love this community. The people I've met from here have been some of the best. The solidarity I felt was a bit overwhelming. But maybe I've caused more harm than good. My biggest fear is accidentally continuing the cycle of abuse I experienced as a kid. And while I haven't done anything I personally consider morally reprehensible, I have said and done some things I regret. Maybe I somewhat continued the cycle of exposing inappropriate topics to children without realizing it. That really sucks. I wish I was as good as the people who idolize me and my work think I am, both as a person and an artist. This is probably temporary. I'll come back eventually, but for now, I need to stop exploiting my own trauma for the sake of telling a story until I heal a bit more.
Statement ends. Now, you can form your own opinions about what Shrimp said here, but if this final speech is anything, it is revealing. Thus far, I've been trying to discuss Escam purely as a text, but doing so is not painting the entire picture. The story of Escam feels like it's written with a level of authenticity that one could only achieve by experiencing what the characters are going through themselves, so it's not surprising to learn that Escam was deeply personal to Shrimp. But knowing that gives this story so much more weight, and makes it so much more important that we think of Escam not just as a text, but as a piece of media with a creator and an audience, both of whom have a rich relationship inexorably intertwined with this series of TikToks. If you've stuck with me for this long, then I hope you'll continue listening as I tell you this story about meat. Remember to chew carefully and to not talk with your mouth full.
As a child, I had a sheep doll made of wool. I always found it interesting how the imitation of the animal was made with the materials of the original. It was crafted in its provider's image. I adored it. It brought me comfort, which it was designed for, I suppose. But I was too attached. Each night that I held it tightly led to it becoming more matted. It lost its softness the more I caressed it with my hands covered in skin cells, dust, and oils. Eventually a button eye popped off. I sewed it back on, but it was never the same. It was slightly lopsided. After a while, you could not even tell what it was originally meant to be. It looked like a dirty clump of string. I was distraught. I turned something cherished and untouched into something unrecognizable. I did not cry when I inevitably had to throw it away. But I came close. My mother chuckled and placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt more mocking than comforting. "The damage is proof of how much you loved it," is what she told me. I think it would be better to not have loved it at all.
Ever since witnessing the death of Escam, one question that I cannot stop asking myself is just, how does this happen? We know that Shrimp understands that a community being formed upon the principle that every member in it can relate to each other's trauma is not good, but still, that doesn't just happen. How does an author become so close with their audience that they feel comfortable going against their fans in rap battles specifically designed to invoke the worst experiences of the participants' lives? Even as a mutually understood joke, that is still crazy. The fact that I can even ask that question in the first place means that millions of things have gone wrong. Remember when we used to make fire with rocks? What happened? However, whenever I'm pondering this and attempting to retrace the hypothetical steps of how we got here, I often conclude that it's not the most unlikely series of events. And to explain why, I need to detail my own relationship with Escam, because I admit I'm at least a little bit biased. Not to brag, but I first discovered Scribble Shrimp slightly before Escam. One day I was randomly recommended a piece of writing of theirs inspired by this one poem on Tumblr. It seems that the post where Shrimp shared their writing has been lost to the ether by now, as I cannot find any proof of it existing, but I swear it was them. Because of this, I followed them just in time to see Escam begin and grow popular. And as it was reaching its peak, I was in a very vulnerable moment in my life. School was exhausting me in a manner that didn't previously feel possible. I was coping with the aftershocks of some deeply distressing developments in my most personal relationships, and I'm gonna fucking relapse tonight. I'm gonna fucking do it. I'm gonna fucking do it. I'm gonna make myself bleed. It just wasn't good. But almost every day I could count on the fact that I could check TikTok and see that @ScribbleShrimp posted a new slideshow of images for me to look at. And for a brief moment, I would forget about my own problems and focus on the assortment of issues these weirdos have. And sometimes a character would say or do or go through something that reminded me of myself and my own experiences. For a fleeting second, I would feel less alone. Escam is not a perfect story. Even ignoring Shrimp's actions, some of the episodes can feel preachy and unnecessary. Some of the metaphors can be heavy-handed and blatant. Sometimes the inspiration for an episode is incredibly obvious, and how seriously can you really take a piece of media that has a dedicated yaoi episode? But despite all of that and more, Escam was a story that felt like me. At some points, transcribing Escam was physically difficult because what I was reading sometimes felt so achingly familiar that it was hard for me to type it because my hands were shaking so much. Escam might almost always be depressing to read, but it provided me comfort with the knowledge that there are people out there who understand what I've gone through and continued through all that and onwards. So with all of that in mind, it's not difficult for me to think that someone who perhaps is a little bit younger than me and has had fewer previous negative experiences with Discord could learn that there is a group with thousands of people in it who are all a fan of this work, but more importantly, all understand them and want to be a part of it. From there they could make friends, perhaps even with the author, as they're quite an active participant in this server. And they could grow comfortable enough with the author that they forget they're talking to someone years older than them with exponentially more influence. And the author could assume that because of this closeness, it would be okay for them to say certain things, to make certain jokes, even if later down the line they will end up reclassifying what they said as profoundly regrettable. Full disclosure, I am a monster. I was/am a member of the Shrimp Tank, though I sent only 9 messages total. I was mostly just an observer, though I guess not observant enough because I sent my last messages days after the rap battle incident. The server has been dormant for almost 8 months now, as the moderators closed access to every channel the day after Shrimp's final speech. Sometimes a moderator will still send a random message somewhere, and a bot still automatically reposts messages that get enough reactions, but by and large, the Shrimp Tank is very much dead. Now that I've explained my perspective, though, I think it's equally as important to acknowledge Shrimp's relationship with Escam.
Every time I post a video, I'm afraid that this will be the one that's too morbid, that's too uncomfortable, the one that will finally prove me right in my feelings of isolation. So far, that hasn't been the case. I feel a contradictory and nauseating mixture of solidarity and sadness when I see hundreds of people relate to a tragic situation. Sometimes I'll see a comment and it'll have the perfect analysis. It's like they reside in my heart, listening to the whispers of intention. And in that moment, I think to myself, there are others who are able to understand. I feel a strange kinship. It's a specific brand of love I haven't experienced before until recently. I have never spoken to these people in real life, yet somehow they understand me more intimately than any of those I encounter on a daily basis. Parasocial relationships go both ways.
Within the idea graveyard I mentioned thousands of words ago, most of those ideas originally came about as a result of me trying to cope with an aspect of my life at the time. I would externalize what I've gone through into the plot of a story, and by doing so, I would finally be in control of what happens to me. I could analyze my perspective from a third-person view. I would be able to perform an autopsy on it, you could say. But the problem with those ideas is that it was all just wallowing. There may have been some interesting plot beats, some cool hypothetical shots I would get, some incredibly impactful lines I could deliver, but those were all just superficial sprinkles placed upon a poisonous cake. Desperate attempts to cover up the fact that all I was doing by telling that story was just trying to survive. And I could never figure out how any of those ideas would end. I could never allow myself a happy ending. I didn't feel like I deserved one. And after reading Shrimp's final speech and looking at Shrimp's final messages in the days before their server shut down, it's clear to me that Escam was a product of quite a similar technique. Shrimp took their worst traits and their worst traumas and extracted them, took the rawest, darkest parts of their psyche and allowed them to crystallize into human beings, to give themselves the ability to reckon with their own faults from a more comfortable distance. Though what differentiates my and Shrimp's execution of this same method is that all of my ideas stayed in the ground, but as soon as Escam began, it just kept growing and growing, and the total amount of eyes that have gazed upon this work must be a number that is truly unfathomable, even when in the grand scheme of things this wasn't even that popular of a series. But regardless, can you imagine what that must feel like? To write yourself a tragedy not starring you, but starring characters with bits and pieces of you so deeply embedded within them, exposing every nook and cranny of your broken mind like that, and allowing millions of strangers to bear witness to it? Of course, remnants of an artist will be present in anything they make. That's just the nature of creation. Paintbrushes will always be piloted by faulty human hands. Clay will always have fingerprints. But not like this. From far away, it's easy to accuse Shrimp of being irresponsible, to call them stupid for not separating themselves enough from this story when they still could. But doing so isn't fair, I don't think. The original plan for Escam was for it to be the last thing that Shrimp ever wrote in their life, so forgive me for the assumption, but I don't think they planned for a fandom to coagulate around it. It's easy to look at the Shrimp tank now and recognize how obvious of a mistake it was to have created a community based upon the fact that everyone in it was irrevocably damaged, and all fans of a piece of writing where the main characters keep on irrevocably damaging each other. But I can't blame Shrimp for that, at least not without feeling guilty, because what else were they supposed to do? Escam was Shrimp letting out one final scream into what they thought was a void, but then the void echoed. Shrimp spent so much of their life convinced that they would never truly be known by those around them, and then suddenly they were overwhelmed with the knowledge that so many strangers know exactly how they feel. They now had tangible evidence that they weren't alone and never would be again. If I was in that situation, I would have let the void envelop me as well. So Shrimp continued writing Escam. Shrimp continued growing closer with people with whom the only thing they had in common was their trauma. Shrimp continued puppeteering the worst parts of themselves for an audience that was only ever expanding. And they never died, but with each new episode they gave up more and more of themselves to the crowd, and if left unchecked without the impending drama, perhaps they would have reached a status equivalent to death, where there would be nothing left to give. Shrimp is not any of Escam's characters, that's been established, but I think, at least in some part, that Escam is Shrimp. To the uninitiated ear, I know that that sounds like just a lot of syllables, but for me, and hopefully you by this point, we understand how significant Escam is to its author and its fans, and why that accidentally all-consuming relationship was something of a mistake. And perhaps, even if it makes me sad to admit, maybe it's a good thing that Escam died when it did.
I was never well liked in school. My coping mechanism for this was, admittedly, a bit strange. I would imagine my own funeral. In this daydream, everyone, even those who threw taunts at me in hallways, would sing my praises. They would reminisce and list all the good traits they were unaware I even had in reality. They would cry and truly miss me. I would be loved. Of course, those classmates didn't care about me, and I didn't care about them, not really, and my actual funeral was a rather pathetic sight. Fitting considering who it was for. It shouldn't come as a surprise that only he came.
Escam has now been dead for over twice as long as it was ever alive. Any fandom activity is long gone. The total number of people who still think about Escam today is likely in the single digits, with me proportionally accounting for like 5 of them. Shrimp still has somewhat of an online presence, but it's really only on Tumblr now. In a slightly recent post, they mentioned how they still have 40-ish unreleased Escam episodes that they will post to AO3 eventually, but not for a long while, as they don't feel ready to post them yet. But if I had to guess, I don't think that they will ever feel ready, and I can't really blame them for that. To become so well known for something so intimately tied to the most vulnerable parts of yourself, and then to have that same thing be the cause of your unflinchingly public downfall, feels like the kind of wound that's going to take a long, long time to heal. Although Shrimp has gone on record saying that every Escam character has a tragic and inevitable ending, I don't think we're ever going to learn what specifically happens to anyone besides Neil. While a part of me definitely desires to learn the canonical fates of these freaks, another part of me understands the value in letting these people rest. Ignoring how obviously draining it would be for Shrimp to have to continue writing them, when I think about Escam these days, I think about how Neil literally bargained his life for just the possibility that he could finally have the last word. And while that may not have been a successful gamble within the story, when you look at Escam as a whole, it's clear he did get his wish. The accidentally final episode has exclusively him talking in it. He got the last word, and just like Neil's, the spirit of Escam still lives on. While poetry has been a staple of TikTok since forever, Escam ushered in a new genre of conversational poetry. Shrimp once jokingly suggested that this specific type of TikTok should be called shrimp posting, but I think I'm going to go with my label on this one. Escam is not the first story to be told largely through different colors of text talking to each other. I think they made a webcomic like that once. However, as far as I can tell, it was the first of its kind on TikTok, and people quickly started to notice how versatile this newly discovered writing format was, and how accessible of a format it would be if you ever wanted to write something similar yourself. Although #ScribbleShrimp on TikTok is now consumed by posts of a certain upset variety made in late February, when Escam was still actively being updated, that hashtag wasn't just full of people cosplaying or kinning the characters. Many people used it as a jumping off point for their own writing. There was an influx of conversational poets on the platform, many of whom are still writing to this day. The most notable example being @LuluShuShu, who now has more followers than Shrimp ever did, but if you scroll down far enough in his profile, you'll see him credit them for inspiration in the captions of his earlier posts. I'm not trying to demean anyone for copying or discredit this guy's work or anything. If anything, I highly recommend him and many more creators if any Escam fans are going through withdrawals, or if any normal people just want to read some really good poetry. I just think it's really nice to see that Escam still has had some positive residual effects, and if Shrimp ever watches this, I would really want them to be aware of that. As they said, anyone can write text on a white background, which means that anyone can become their own storyteller. Escam helped so many people in its own right, but it also motivated so many people to use writing to keep themselves moving, in spite of everything else that may compel them to do otherwise. And I think that's really beautiful.
When I was younger, I was convinced the moment I started transitioning, all my unrelated mental health issues would disappear, I guess. That my mood swings and attachment problems and impulsivity would somehow vaporize if I grew some stubble. I kept giving myself goals, stretches of time to survive, until I finally reached the ever-elusive happiness. I just need to survive middle school. I just need to survive this camp. I just need to survive high school. I just need to survive until I'm an adult. Then I'll be fine. Obviously, that wasn't the case. I feel more comfortable in my body now. My dysphoria isn't quite as bad, but everything else still is.
Escam is a story about meat. Simultaneously, it is a story about a teenager desperately attempting to reconcile with themselves by any means necessary. And what you are just about to finish watching is a very similar person doing a very similar thing. I have wanted to make something about Escam ever since last December, when it was still breathing. But ever since February, the idea of doing so became a lot more morally difficult. Of course, it would be a necessity to mention everything that happened, but if I did, it always just felt like an inescapable stopping point. I could never figure out where to go from there. I would always need to ask myself, what happens now? And I've asked myself that question many times over the past 2 years. If I counted on my fingers the amount of times I was convinced I was feeling the worst I had ever felt and will ever feel, I would be a mutant freak because I would have way too many hands. And in those moments, when I'm surrounded by this all-encompassing misery, of course, a helping hand provided by someone close to me could easily pull me out. But not always. Sometimes sadness instills itself so deeply within you that the only person who can save you is yourself, which feels like an impossible task. And in those moments, I find that it's the media I consume that saves me. For me and so many other people, that's what Escam was. Something that saved us. We saw ourselves in these characters, their flaws, their hardships, their experiences. It reminded me of me. If some stranger online could write something that felt so distinctly familiar and relatable, then it was proof that I wasn't alone in these thoughts I was having. And for Shrimp, Escam provided an even more significant service. I imagine it must have felt so completely surreal to write something originally with the intention of it marking the end of your life, to write something with such an intrinsic finality to it, then to haphazardly decide to post it online before you go, and suddenly be met with so many people getting it. I wouldn't know what to do. But if that happened to me, I do think it would have provided me with a reason to survive myself. However, with so many people giving this story so much weight, it feels almost inevitable that it would buckle under itself at some point. The Escam fandom dissolving how it did feels like just some awful random chance. If it wasn't going to be because of the rap battle, then it was going to be something else at a later point. The idea of that volatile of a community maintaining itself indefinitely feels impossible. But again, what happens now? To dedicate so much of yourself to something, then to have it ripped away without warning, what are you supposed to do with that? Well, the only thing you can do is continue. There will come times in your life where you make a mistake and damage someone irrevocably. Despite everything you do, you will not be forgiven. The guilt will eat at you in every waking moment. If you are not careful, it will swallow you whole. But you must not let it. You must learn to live with it. With time, the weight of your actions will grow lighter, and eventually you will forget you're carrying them at all. And sometimes you will be the one who is hurt. You will be unable to remember any previous moment where you felt anything else besides this ever-present pain. And your heart will fill with hatred and violent thoughts of retribution. If you are not careful, you will implode. But you must not let it destroy you. You must learn to accept your wounds and your scars. With time, the agony will lessen in its severity, and eventually it will assimilate into the rest of yourself. In either scenario, there is a sun around the bend. You will have no choice but to continue through this and onwards. You will cry until you are sick, then you will wash your face and keep moving. Thank you.